Oregon, 1,888. 30 cowboys stood frozen. Rafe Mercer lay pinned beneath tons of collapsed timber, face white as bone, breath ragged, then looked straight up at her. A woman like you can't save me. Beatrice Holloway didn't look away, not even for a second. Then it will trouble you considerably when I do. This is the story of the woman who did what 30 cowboys couldn't. Stay with me, it starts right now. The rain had been falling for 3 hours before Rafe Mercer heard the shouting. He stood at the window first. The lantern light didn't reach past the porch. He grabbed his coat anyway. The creek running beside the front road had risen past its banks. He could hear it before he saw it, a low and churning roar beneath the sound of rain. He took the fence line rather than the road, mud pulling at his boots with every step. At the gate, he held up his lantern. A woman stood in the water up to her knees. She was broad-shouldered and solid, and she wasn't panicking. She had one arm hooked under a boy's ribs, keeping his head above the waterline. With her other hand, she gripped a branch wedged against something in the ditch, a wagon half swallowed by the flood. Rafe recognized the boy first, Jonah Pike, 15 years old and supposed to be back before dark. "Hold still," the woman said. She wasn't saying it to Rafe. She was saying it to Jonah, calm and firm, the same voice you'd use with a spooked animal. "I've got you. Don't fight the current." Rafe got into the water. He didn't ask questions. He took Jonah from her arms, lifted the boy against his chest, and waited for the bank. He heard the woman behind him, heard the heavy splash of her steps. He got Jonah onto dry ground and turned around. She was hauling a canvas bag out of the ditch, heavy by the way she moved. She set it on the fence post and checked the seal on it. Then and only then looked up at Rafe. Her clothes were soaked through. There were cuts on both her palms. She stood in the rain and breathed steadily, hands at her sides. "That's the medicine," she said, "for the ranch. He told me it needed to get through tonight." Rafe looked at the bag, then at her. "Who are you?" She told him her name. Beatrice Holloway, traveling to Juniper Crossing to look for work as a schoolteacher. She'd found Jonah when the wagon overturned. "The bridge into town washed out 2 miles back," she said. "I couldn't go forward." Rafe lifted Jonah against his shoulder. The boy's breathing was shallow but steady. "Come inside," Rafe said. "I'm not asking for charity." He stopped walking, looked back at her. She was already wringing water from her sleeve. "I didn't offer any," he said. "Come inside." She came. The ranch house was lit from within. Nell Mercer, Rafe's aunt, had a fire going and 2 blankets ready before they crossed the threshold. She took one look at Jonah and sent a hand for Dr. Miriam Cole without being asked. Beatrice stood in the doorway and didn't move further until Nell waved her in. "Sit," Nell said, "both of you." Rafe set Jonah on the settee near the fire. He turned to find Beatrice already examining her own hands, turning them palm up in the firelight. Not wincing, just looking. He pulled a chair and sat across from her. "You said you came from Juniper Crossing." "I was going to Juniper Crossing," she said. "There's a difference, teacher," he said. "Yes, where before that?" She met his eyes here and there. "My father and I moved often for his work." She didn't offer more, he didn't push, not yet. Nell refilled the kettle and mentioned, without making much of it, that the schoolteacher who'd been working for the ranch families had left 2 weeks ago. Her husband had taken ill. She was gone without notice, and the children hadn't had lessons since. Rafe watched Beatrice. She didn't look up from her tea. "How long were you planning to stay in Juniper Crossing?" he asked. "As long as the work lasted. I've got 5 children here who need a teacher. Families that work this ranch. I can offer you 30 days, a room, meals, and a wage." He set his cup down. "You won't interfere with the cattle crews. You won't walk into the loading areas or the barns without asking first. You teach the children, and that's all." She was quiet for a moment. "What's the wage?" he told her. She thought about it the same way she'd thought about everything else. "Without rushing 30 days, she said. "Agreed." "Good." He stood. "Nell will show you to the bunkhouse." "She'll do no such thing," Nell said, from the kitchen. Rafe turned. Nell kept her back to him. The bunkhouse is for hired men. She'll have the second room upstairs." Rafe said nothing. After a moment, he nodded once and went to check on Jonah. The boy was sleeping by the time Dr. Miriam arrived. Bruised ribs, a shallow cut above the ear. Nothing broken. Miriam wrapped his hands and said he'd need 2 days of rest. Beatrice had moved to a chair in the corner. She wasn't sleeping. She was watching Jonah breathe. Rafe paused in the doorway on his way out. She didn't look up. "He's going to be fine," Rafe said. "I know," she said. He believed her. Upstairs, Nell had put a candle on the windowsill of the second room and turned down the quilt. Beatrice set her traveling bag on the chair and her father's leather notebook on the nightstand. She didn't undress. She went back down in the dark, out through the side door, and walked to where the wagon sat half buried at the edge of the road. The rain had led up to a drizzle. She held her lantern low and crouched beside the axle. She knew what a broken axle looked like. She'd seen enough of them. Wood, failing under load, left a certain kind of split, ragged, and uneven. This wasn't that. This was a clean cut on one side, then fracture where the pressure finished the job. Someone had started the brake before Jonah ever left town. She ran her thumb along the iron pin at the base of the wheel mount. Still there, bent but not snapped. She tilted the lantern closer. A small mark pressed into the metal, not scratched in afterward. Cast in, a crescent shape, clean and deliberate. Beatrice stayed very still. She had seen that mark before. 7 years ago in the wreckage of a bridge. Her father's bridge, the one that had killed him. She stood up slowly. Across the flooded creek on the far bank, something moved in the dark. A horse, a rider, sitting still, not moving toward her, just watching. She didn't call out. She walked back to the house at the same unhurried pace and went upstairs. Her trunk had been moved, not much. An inch, maybe 2. The latch was the same, but the small thread she kept tucked beneath the lid was gone. She opened the trunk. Her clothes were there. The money she'd wrapped in cloth was there. She turned through each page of her father's notebook, slowly. One page missing. She knew which one without counting. The drawing of Blackwater Bridge. The last thing her father had ever measured before he died. Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the rain started again. She didn't sleep for a long time. The schoolroom had been a storage room once. Someone had pushed the shelves to the walls and dragged in 5 chairs of varying height. The chalkboard was a piece of lumber painted black. It had been wiped. So many times the surface had worn smooth in the middle and still held chalk dust at the edges. Beatrice stood in front of it on her first morning and looked at the 5 children, looking back at her. Jonah Pike sat in the largest chair. His ribs were wrapped, and he wasn't supposed to lift anything. So Rafe had sent him to lessons. He sat with his arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had agreed to something he already regretted. The 4 younger ones, all children of ranch workers, sat in a row and waited. One of them was picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. Another was staring at the window. Outside, 2 cowboys leaning on the fence watched through the glass. One of them said something, and the other laughed. Beatrice picked up a piece of chalk. "How much feed does a horse eat in a week?" she asked. Silence. "Guess," she said. Boy in the second chair said 12 pounds. Jonah said 20. "Between 14 and 20, depending on size and work," Beatrice said. "Now, Mercy Ridge has 40 horses. If feed costs $2 per 100 pounds, how much does Mr. Mercer spend on horses in a month?" The girl who'd been picking at her sleeve looked up. Beatrice handed her the chalk. By mid-morning, they were calculating wagon loads. By noon, they were arguing over whether a heavier wagon going downhill posed a different problem than the same wagon on flat ground. Jonah got pulled into the argument against his will and didn't notice when he stopped looking bored. Beatrice wrote the numbers as they came. She explained that every figure on the board existed somewhere on this ranch. Feed bins, wheel axles, bridge timber, shipping contracts. Math wasn't something that lived in books. It lived in whatever broke when you got it wrong. The children came back the next morning 10 minutes early. She noticed Jonah staying after the others left, standing close to her desk. She had spread some papers out to plan the following day's lesson. He wasn't looking at the lesson notes. He was looking at the pages beneath them, where a series of mechanical drawings had slipped partway out of a leather folder. "What is that?" he asked. She covered them. "Geometry," she said, which was true enough. He looked at her. He was 15, and smart enough to know that wasn't the full answer, but he let it go. Rafe noticed the early arrivals by the third day. He didn't say anything to Beatrice. He mentioned it to Nell, and Nell smiled into her coffee. The grain loft problem announced itself on a Tuesday. Beatrice was walking the children through the ranch after lessons, showing them how to estimate distances by counting strides. She had brought them inside the grain barn to demonstrate how height affected the weight distribution of stacked sacks. She looked up at the ceiling supports and stopped talking. The loft above them had been loaded beyond what the center joists were designed to hold. She could see it in the bow of the main beam. A long, slow curve downward, barely visible, unless you were looking for it. But she was looking for it. "Outside," she said quietly. They went. 3 minutes later, the center ceiling support gave a crack like a rifle shot. Dust fell in a column through the barn door. The loft held, but only because the wall brackets caught the weight the beam could no longer carry. Mateo Ruiz appeared at her shoulder. He was a compact man, the ranch foreman, and he'd been watching the children file out. "What happened?" "The main loft beam was overloaded," Beatrice said. "It's still standing, but the center is compromised. You'll want to move the sacks toward the walls before you add any more weight." His jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for your opinion on the barn." "No," she said, "but I had my students standing under it, so I couldn't very well keep it to myself." He reported it to Rafe. That evening, Rafe came to the schoolroom while she was putting away the chalk. "Mateo says you disrupted the grain operation this afternoon." Beatrice set down the chalk. "I moved 5 children away from a beam that subsequently cracked. I told your foreman which sacks needed to be relocated. That's the full extent of it. You're here to teach." "Yes." She turned to face him. "But Wood doesn't care whether the person warning you is a teacher or a carpenter." The beam bowed the same way either. He held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted there, though he didn't let it show fully. "You can inspect any structure the children use," he said at last. "If you find something, you tell me or Mateo. You don't tell the children or the hands. And you don't go near the cattle loading area." "That's not a request." "Understood." He left. Beatrice stood in the empty room and breathed out slowly. She went to examine the schoolroom furniture the following morning before the children arrived. One of the chair legs had been properly mended. The loose joint on the back bench had been repegged and sanded. The repair was careful and unhurried, done by someone who knew what they were doing and wasn't in a rush to be credited for it. She had heard no hammering the night before. She hadn't heard anything at all. That afternoon, a telegram arrived for Nell. Beatrice was in the kitchen when Nell read it at the table. Nell set it down and looked at Rafe. "Vale Freight is requesting permanent access rights to Mercer Narrows." Rafe said nothing for a moment. The Narrows was a natural river crossing at the eastern edge of his property. Anyone who controlled it controlled the fastest freight route between 3 counties. "What name?" Beatrice asked. Nell looked at her. "Lucian Vale. He owns Vale Freight. Operates out of—" "I know who he is," Beatrice said. She said it too quickly. She picked up her coffee cup and turned toward the window. Rafe watched her back. She felt it. She didn't turn around. She already knew that most of the iron pins, lifting chains, and rigging equipment in Juniper Crossing came through Vale Freight. She'd been asking quiet questions for 3 days. The blacksmith sourced through Vale. The livery stable sourced through Vale. Nearly every weight-bearing component used in the valley had passed through his supply chain at some point. She understood now that Mercy Ridge was not an accident of geography. Late that night, someone painted a crescent shape on the schoolroom door, river mud, still wet when Beatrice touched it before dawn. The same crescent, the same proportions. She wiped it off before the children arrived and said nothing to anyone. That evening, she graded arithmetic sheets on the porch while the light held. Jonah came around the corner of the barn at a half-run, which told her his ribs were feeling better, and held something out to her. An iron pin. Old, corroded at one end, but the casting was intact. He'd found it beneath the grain storage floor while helping move the sacks. Beatrice held the lantern close. The mold seam was in the wrong place. She had seen that exact flaw before. Improperly tempered iron, a mold that had never been corrected, used on a batch of components that were supposed to have been pulled from circulation after a bridge failure in 1881, her father's bridge. She closed her fingers around the pin. "Where exactly did you find this?" she asked. Jonah told her. She memorized the location. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it to anyone else." He nodded. He was learning when to ask questions and when not to. She sat on the porch long after the house went dark. The accident in the grain barn happened on a Wednesday morning. 3 ranch hands were lifting sacks of grain, using the overhead pulley in the main storage room. The rope had been showing wear for some time. Beatrice had noticed it 2 days prior and mentioned it to Mateo. He'd said it would hold through the week. It did not hold through the week. The rope snapped at the crown of the pulley, while a full load was suspended 8 feet off the ground. The sacks swung hard, and the load started dropping. One of the hands dove sidewise, another grabbed for the rope end and missed. Beatrice was passing the barn door. She went in fast, grabbed the iron turning wheel with both hands, and locked it against the frame with her hip to stop the axle from spinning free. With her other hand, she caught the doubled rope below the brake and ran 2 wrapping passes through the lower bracket, then a locking hitch that pulled tight under the weight. The load stopped, swinging slightly. Still in the air, she held her position until the hands recovered and got a second rope underneath. Mateo was there a minute later. He looked at the knot. He looked at her. He walked around the apparatus slowly. "Where did you learn to tie that?" he said. "My father taught me some useful techniques," Beatrice said. He worked in heavy construction. Mateo knew knots. He'd worked ranches and loading yards for 20 years. What he was looking at was an industrial rigging hitch, the type used on suspension loads over 200 pounds. Not something a man picked up in an afternoon, and not something a woman teaching arithmetic to farm children would learn from casual conversation. He didn't say anything further to her, but she saw him watching her differently after that. Rafe heard about it. By noon, he didn't ask her directly. He went to the grain barn and looked at the bracket where the knot had been tied. He spent some time with that. In town that afternoon, Beatrice accompanied Nell to the dry goods store and the telegraph office. Juniper Crossing was a narrow main street with false front buildings and a water trough that needed replacing. A group of men, outside the feed store, watched her cross the street. One of them said something that drew a laugh from the others. She kept walking. A woman coming out of the millinery glanced at her dress, then her face, and looked away too quickly. Beatrice had learned young that people decided things about her before she opened her mouth. She had also learned that most of them eventually needed to revise that decision. She was reading the posted wagon weights on the freighting board outside the land office when Rafe appeared beside her. He had been speaking with the land clerk inside. She hadn't known he was coming to town. He looked at what she was reading, then at the supply wagon parked at the hitching rail. "Miss Holloway," he said, loud enough that the men near the feed store could hear it. "I've been meaning to ask your opinion on the weight my supply wagon can take on that road to the south pasture. The grade changes near the ridge. I'd like your assessment." She looked at the wagon. The men near the store went quiet. She walked around it once. She checked the wheel gauge, the axle diameter, the hitch placement. She estimated the load in the bed by the depth of the wheel ruts. "The current load is manageable on the flat," she said, "but the rear axle is carrying more than the front." On a downhill grade with that imbalance, you're looking at drift on soft ground. Move two of those crates forward and redistribute toward the center. Rafe nodded, as though she had confirmed something he'd already suspected. I appreciate it, he said. They walked on. She didn't thank him. She didn't look at the men near the feed store to see their reaction. But the gestures had been clear to everyone who witnessed it, including her. He hadn't rushed to her defense. He hadn't made a scene. He had simply asked her a professional question in a public place and listened to the answer. Lucian Vale stepped out of the bank. He was a tall man, well-dressed for a town this size, silver at his temples, a close-trimmed beard. He moved without any particular hurry, the manner of someone who hadn't been told no in a long time. He saw Beatrice and stopped. Miss Holloway, he said, not surprised. That was the first thing she noticed. He wasn't surprised at all. Malcolm's daughter. I didn't expect to see you in this part of the territory. Mr. Vale. He smiled pleasantly. I run a school in Ridgeton that could use a teacher of your apparent talents. Funded it myself. Good salary, proper building, a real position. I have a position, Beatrice said. At Mercy Ridge. He nodded as though this was already known to him. A temporary one, I understand. She said nothing. Vale's expression didn't change. He lowered his voice slightly, not hiding what he was saying, just moderating the volume. Your father was a talented man, a brilliant man, some would say. The trouble was he never knew the limits of his own designs. That kind of confidence without caution cost people their lives. He paused. It cost him his. Beatrice looked at him steadily. Her hands were still at her sides. Good afternoon, Miss Vale. She walked past him. Rafe fell into step beside her. He had heard enough. She could tell by the set of his jaw, though he didn't speak until they were 2 blocks down and out of Vale's sightline. Your father worked for him, Rafe said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And the bridge he mentioned. My father designed the Blackwater crossing east of here 7 years ago, Beatrice said. There was a collapse during the final load test. He died in it. She kept her pace steady. Vale's company supplied the iron components. Rafe was quiet for a moment. And you came to Juniper Crossing because I came to look for work, she said. Which was true, as far as it went. He let it sit. She was grateful he didn't press. He asked Nell that evening to look into Vale's freight contracts, his property acquisitions, and any land purchases made in the region after major transportation accidents. Beatrice knew because Nell told her later, without Rafe's knowledge, because Nell had decided within the first 3 days that she liked Beatrice and intended to keep her informed. Beatrice didn't tell Nell everything either. What she did was begin a systematic inspection of every piece of Vale-manufactured equipment at Mercy Ridge. She did it quietly, in the early mornings and after dark. She noted dimensions, mold seams, temper marks. She wrote nothing in her father's notebook. She used a separate sheet she kept inside the lining of her coat. The cattle loading structure sat at the far end of the main yard. Rafe had told her not to enter it. She had agreed to those terms. She didn't enter it. She walked the perimeter on a Sunday evening while the hands were at supper. She carried her lantern low and moved along the outside of the timber frame, reading the structure from the ground. What she found there required a closer look. She went in. The 3 load-bearing iron pins at the base of the central platform were discolored. She crouched beside each one and held the lantern close. The casting on all 3 showed the same flaw she'd seen in the pin Jonah had brought her. The same irregular seam, the same surface pitting that indicated insufficient tempering. Under enough stress, they wouldn't bend, they would shear. She pulled a piece of chalk from her pocket and marked each one with a small X. Clear enough to find in the morning, small enough not to draw attention from a distance. She was back in her room before the hands finished supper. At first light, she returned. Every chalk mark was gone. The pins stood clean in the early morning, unmarked, as though she had never touched them. Beatrice straightened up slowly. Someone had been watching her. Someone who knew why she was there and wanted those markings gone. someone with access to this yard in the dark, who understood exactly what those marks meant. She put the chalk back in her pocket and walked to the house for breakfast. She ate without hurrying. She answered Jonah's arithmetic question about bridge loading. She listened to Nell talk about the new telegrams from the territorial office. She did not tell Rafe what she had found. Not yet. Beatrice found Rafe at the stable before breakfast. She didn't wait for a good time. There wasn't going to be one. The cattle loading structure needs to be closed, she said, today, before you move any animals through it. He turned from the horse he was checking. His expression was careful, which told her he'd already been thinking about this. She laid it out plainly. The 3 pins at the base of the central platform were flawed metal. She had found them twice, marked them, and come back to find the marks gone. The flaw wasn't cosmetic. It was in the tempering process, which meant the iron looked sound on the surface and carried full load until it didn't. At a certain pressure threshold, it wouldn't bend. It would shear straight through. Rafe listened. Then he said he'd take a look. He walked the structure for 20 minutes. She stood at the fence and watched him check the cross-bracing, the rope guides, the visible timbers. He crouched and ran his hand along the base planks. He came back. The timber looks sound, he said. The timber isn't the problem. I can't see what you're describing. Because the flaw is in the metal, not the wood. Iron pins that weren't properly tempered look identical to good ones until load exceeds their actual tolerance. After that, they don't warn you. They just fail. He looked out at the south field, where 300 cattle were already penned. The buyer's men were arriving from Carson by midday. This shipment paid November wages. December's too, if he was being honest about the numbers. Mateo arrived beside Rafe without being summoned. He stood with his arms crossed and said nothing. But his position made his opinion clear. Mr. Mercer, Mateo said, I've run cattle through that structure 40 times this season without incident. Past performance doesn't indicate present safety, Beatrice said. The load today is 300 head, moving at pressure and speed. The pins may have been under their failure threshold in previous runs. Today is different. Mateo's jaw tightened. She doesn't understand cattle operations. I understand load-bearing structures, she said, and left it at that. Rafe looked at her. He wasn't dismissing her. She could see that. He was doing the calculation that men in his position always did, weighing the cost of caution against the cost of error. What work did you do before coming here? He asked. The question was direct, and she had known it was coming. I worked with my father, she said. He was a bridge engineer. I was on contracts with him from the time I was 12 until a few years before he died. A bridge builder. Yes, and that's the basis for condemning my loading structure. The engineering is the same, she said. Distributed weight over a fixed frame carried through pin connections to the foundation. Your cattle don't know they're not crossing a bridge. He was quiet. She watched him make his decision and knew, before he opened his mouth, what it was going to be. I'll reduce the load, he said. 2 groups instead of 1. That's not sufficient. It's the decision I'm making. She felt the anger rise and kept her voice level. Running 2 groups through compromised pins doesn't protect anything. You're testing the same failure points twice. That's worse, Miss Holloway, he said it firmly. You arrived here 2 weeks ago. You haven't told me your full history. You've been in areas of this ranch you agreed to avoid. He paused. I cannot close this operation on a warning. I have no way to verify. You can't walk onto my property, conceal who you are, and expect me to follow every unexplained instruction. She looked at him steadily. Timber and iron don't care whether the person identifying the danger is a man or a woman. If those pins fail, they'll fail the same way, regardless of what you think of my experience. He held her gaze. Then he walked back toward the yard. She stood at the fence and didn't leave. An hour later, Lucian Vale's buggy came through the gate. Vale climbed down at his usual unhurried pace and shook Rafe's hand. He called it a professional courtesy. The Narrows access discussion was upcoming, and he wanted to maintain goodwill. Rafe didn't look comfortable, but didn't turn him away. Beatrice stayed where she was and watched. Vale moved through the yard casually, pausing to speak with one of the hands, then stepping aside to speak briefly with a man in a dun-colored coat she didn't recognize. Not one of Rafe's crew. The conversation lasted less than half a minute. Vale clapped the man's shoulder and drifted back toward Rafe. Jonah appeared at the fence beside her. "That man in the dun coat," Jonah said quietly. "He came out of the loading structure a while ago. Before Mr. Vale arrived, I was bringing water to the south pen." Beatrice kept her eyes on the yard. "Are you certain it was that structure?" "He came out the side door," Jonah said. "I've never seen him before." She tracked Vale across the yard. He stood now with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the cattle operation with the relaxed attention of someone with nothing to hide and nowhere to be. She ran the logic forward. Vale wouldn't place himself at the scene of a collapse unless he was certain where the failure would occur and certain it wouldn't reach him. The central platform. That was where the pins were weakest. That was also the only position from which a man would oversee a loading operation of this size. Rafe would stand at the center. Vale would watch from the fence. He wasn't trying to damage the structure. He was trying to kill Rafe. She pushed off the fence and crossed the yard at a pace that didn't look like running. "Get off the platform," she said when she reached Rafe. He turned. His expression told her they were done having this conversation. "Rafe." She dropped the formal address without thinking about it. "The man in the dun coat. He was inside that structure this morning, and he's not one of your crew. I need you to step off the center platform." Rafe scanned the yard. The man in the dun coat was nowhere to be seen. Vale was watching them now. Not approaching, just watching. "I'll inspect it myself before we start," Rafe said. "I always walk the structure before I send my men onto it." "That's precisely." She stopped. She couldn't finish the sentence without telling him everything, and there wasn't time to do it properly. "Stay off the center section, please." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll see what I can see," he said. "Beatrice," he said it quietly, without heat. "Wait at the fence?" She went back to the fence. She kept her eyes on him. He climbed onto the structure and walked to the center. He crouched, ran a hand along the base, and turned to look back at her. His expression said he didn't see it. She gripped the top rail. The crack was sharp and low, nothing like wood splitting. It came from underneath, from the iron giving way in a single clean shear, the way she had known it would. Then the platform came down. The collapse happened in sections. Center first, the outer frames folding inward like something being swallowed. The noise was extraordinary, splintering timber and iron banding and the screaming of the cattle in the adjacent pen. And then a wall of dust and rain rose into the gray sky. Beatrice was through the fence before the first cloud settled. She wasn't the only one running. The hands were closer and reached the wreckage ahead of her. Rafe was visible. That was the first thing. He was on his back in the debris, the main support beam across his left leg. One end of it rested on a section of collapsed platform. The other end sat directly beneath a section of the upper frame that hadn't finished moving yet. Rainwater was already collecting in the low sections of the yard and running into the wreckage. He was conscious. His face was white beneath the dust. Mateo was already organizing. "Get ropes on the beam," he said. "Get horses up." The hands moved fast. They were good men, and they weren't wasting time. Ropes went around the main beam from 3 angles, 2 men per rope, and 4 horses were brought in from the near corral. Mateo gave the count, and they pulled. The beam moved. A crosspiece in the upper frame shifted with it and dropped 2 feet, stopping directly above Rafe's chest. Beatrice stepped to the front of the lead horse and put her hand flat on his nose. "Stop," she said. The horse stopped. The handler stared at her. Mateo was already signaling for the second pull. "Stop," she said, again, louder. "If you pull again, that section comes down on his chest. Look at where it stopped." Mateo looked. His jaw moved, but he didn't give the signal yet. "We need more force," one of the hands said. "You need to apply force from a different direction," Beatrice said. The beam is connected to the upper frame on the south side. Every pull you make going east moves the frame with it. More horses won't change that. You're pulling the wrong way against the wrong anchor points. The men looked at Mateo. Mateo looked at the beam. He looked at the crosspiece. A rope snapped the tail of it, caught a cowboy across the shoulder, and tunk off his feet. He hit the mud hard and lay there for a moment before the men around him got him up. The yard went quiet. "I need the 2 turning wheels from the grain barn," Beatrice said. "I need every wagon chain in the yard. I need the broken rear axle from the wagon behind the forge, and I need 2 of your heaviest draft horses, not the quarter horses." She said it to no one in particular and to everyone at once. After a moment, 2 men moved, then 4, then the rest. She stepped into the debris field. From beneath the beam, Rafe's voice came out, rough and controlled. "Beatrice, get out." She crouched 2 feet from him and kept her attention on the upper frame above them. "Tell me where the pain is worst." "My leg." "Can you feel your foot?" A pause. "Yes, the beam is on muscle," she said. "The break is higher in the structure, not in your leg. Stay still. Don't try to pull yourself free. If you shift the position of your leg, you change the load distribution on the frame above you." She stood. "A woman like you can't save me." She was already turning toward the incoming equipment. She stopped for half a second. Then she looked back at him. "Then it will trouble you considerably when I do." The turning wheels arrived. She directed the first one to a position north of the beam, braced against a standing section of the east wall. The second went south, anchored to the remaining gatepost. She ran the chain through both wheels in a doubled loop, using the compound path to change the mechanical advantage. Instead of pulling with the strength of horses directly, the system would multiply that force and redirect it along a line parallel to the beam rather than across it. The broken axle went in as a spreader bar to keep the chain from binding at the center wheel. She addressed the yard without raising her voice. "I've spent years designing lifting systems," she said. It wasn't a speech, just a fact she was stating, so they'd know why to follow her instructions. "This will work, but only if you do exactly what I tell you, and nothing else." She pointed to Mateo. 8 men on the tension line here. You hold, you don't pull. If the chain starts to lose pressure, you call out before you add anything. She pointed to a tall hand near the horses. "You control the draft team. They move on my count, not before." She organized the rest. 6 men at the base of the upper frame on the south side, hands braced to steady the section as it moved. She didn't need them to lift. She needed them to keep the frame from swinging when the beam shifted beneath it. 10 men positioned on the east side to guide Rafe clear the moment the beam lifted enough. 6 more as backup. 30 men, 4 groups. She placed every one of them in under 2 minutes. She took the brake handle herself. The iron lever on the grain barn's turning wheel now set as the primary anchor. She crouched low at the center of the system, low enough that her stance kept the wheel stable in the mud. From that position, she could see all 4 groups, both wheels, the draft team, and the beam. "On my count," she said. 3. The draft horses leaned into their traces. The chain took the load and went taut. 2. The compound system began to work. The force traveling through 2 turning wheels divided and redirected, arriving at the beam from a new angle, parallel rather than perpendicular, lifting rather than dragging. 1. The beam moved 1 inch, then another. Hold. Everything stopped. The beam held its new position. The upper frame didn't move. She looked at the south side team. They had the frame. She looked at Mateo's line. Still tight again. 3 more inches. She counted 5 more sequences. The beam rose steadily, 1 careful interval at a time, the upper frame shifting with it now, but guided by the steadying hands on the south side. Then the beam was clear of his leg. "Pull him," she said. The 2 men who'd been standing ready moved in immediately. They pulled Rafe clear in a single motion, fast and low, and got him to the edge of the debris field. 4 seconds later, the upper frame let go, and the remainder of the structure came down in a cloud of timber and dust. The chain went slack. Beatrice released the brake and stood up from the mud. The yard was completely silent except for the rain. She walked into the wreckage. The hands stepped back to give her room without being asked. She moved carefully, reading the debris as she went, tracking toward where the central platform had been. She found the sheared pin buried under a section of iron banding. She dug it out with both hands and held it up in the light. Vale's crescent mark sat on the base of it, pressed in during manufacture. Unmistakable. She turned toward the yard. This collapse was deliberate, she said. She wasn't yelling. Her voice carried anyway. The pin was manufactured with a flaw built into it. Flawed iron in a structure built to carry live cattle is not an accident. Someone put this here, knowing what it would do. She held it out so the nearest men could see the mark. Every component on this property with that mark on it needs to be pulled and quarantined. Today, Mateo looked at the pin in her hand. He didn't argue. Dr. Miriam arrived at a run and went straight to Rafe. She had a bag and a no-nonsense expression, and the hands cleared a wide path. Rafe was sitting up. His trouser leg was torn and the muscle had been badly compressed, but the leg was straight. He'd keep it. He found Beatrice across the yard. She was still holding the pin. Her coat was gray with dust. Her boots sunk to the ankle in mud, and the 30 cowboys who had ignored her 20 minutes ago were watching her without making a sound. "You have full authority," Rafe said. His voice was rough from the pain. "Every structure on this property, every piece of mechanical equipment, whatever you need." She nodded once. He looked like he wanted to say more, but Miriam pressed something against his shoulder and told him to stop talking. Beatrice put the pin in her coat pocket. That night, after the house went quiet, and Miriam had confirmed Rafe was stable and sedated, Beatrice took the pin to the forge. She set it on the anvil with a cold chisel and struck it twice. The pin split lengthwise. The break was clean. She held the lantern close to the interior of the casing. The iron inside was a different shade from the outer surface. Fresher somehow, not aged the way it should have been. And there, pressed into the base of the casting, at the moment of manufacture, was a production stamp. She moved the lantern closer. 1,879. The condemned batch. The batch the investigation had ordered destroyed after her father's bridge came down in 1,881. Every component from that production run was supposed to have been pulled from supply and melted. Someone had kept them, had stored them somewhere, and been selling them quietly for 7 years, moving them through supply chains and into bridges and loading structures and lifting systems throughout the territory. Her father hadn't made a mistake. He had been handed defective iron by someone who knew exactly what it was. And when the bridge failed, that someone had let Malcolm Holloway carry the blame into his grave. Beatrice set the two halves of the pin side by side on the anvil. She sat on the forward stool in the dark for a long time. The rain kept falling on the roof above her. Rafe woke to the sound of hammering. It was steady and unhurried, coming from the direction of the ruined loading yard. He lay still for a moment, locating himself. His leg was wrapped from knee to hip. The room was bright with mid-morning light. He had slept far longer than he intended. He got up on the second attempt, using the bedpost and refusing to call for help. From the window, he could see the yard below. The debris from the collapse had been organized into separate piles, timber apart from iron, salvageable apart from waste. Beatrice stood at the center of it with a length of rope in one hand, speaking to 8 or 9 of his cowboys. She pointed to a specific beam section, and 3 men moved it without discussion. Yesterday, those same men had stood and watched her, with their arms crossed. Mateo appeared in the doorway behind her, and she turned and said something. Mateo nodded once. Then he turned to the nearest group of hands and repeated what she'd said, as though it were his own instruction. It wasn't, and every man present knew it. Rafe got himself downstairs. Dr. Miriam found him on the porch before he made it to the steps and told him to sit down. He sat down. She checked his leg and replaced the outer wrapping and told him he would be on a cane for 3 weeks and on a horse in 6. He thanked her. She told him to direct his thanks toward the woman in the yard. Beatrice came back to the porch at noon. She had been on her feet since before dawn. Her hair had come loose on one side, and she was still wearing yesterday's work coat. She saw him sitting up and stopped. "You should be in bed," she said. "I woke up," he said. She came up the steps and set a piece of iron on the porch railing beside him. One of the defective pins, whole this time. She sat in the chair, across from him, and didn't speak immediately. He didn't wait for an easier moment. "I said something while I was trapped under that beam," Rafe said. "I had no right to say it." "No," she agreed. "You didn't. I was in pain." "That's not an excuse." He stopped there. He didn't dress it up further, or ask her to weigh his circumstances against the words. Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "Saving your life doesn't require me to forgive you immediately," she said. "Give me time." "All right," he said. She looked slightly surprised that he didn't argue. "Most men push back on that," she said. "I'm aware. I was wrong," he said. Pushing back on it wouldn't change that. Matteo came up the steps that afternoon and stood in front of Beatrice. He held his hat in his hands. He was not comfortable, and he wasn't pretending to be. Several of the hands were working nearby and could hear him clearly. "What I told you about the barn," he said, "about your opinion, and what I said in front of the loading structure before it came down." He paused. "I was wrong on both counts. You stopped us from making it worse. We would have killed him trying to help him." Beatrice didn't dismiss it or tell him not to worry. "I accept that," she said. "Thank you, Matteo." He nodded and put his hat back on and went back to work. Over the following 2 days, Beatrice continued her inspection of the ranch and found 7 more defective components: 2 load-bearing pins on the east barn, 1 lifting bracket above the hay mow, 4 sections of chain link in the main corral gate. All of them carried the crescent mark. All of them were from the condemned 1,879 batch. She set each one aside and documented its location, its application, and the approximate load it had been carrying. Nell had been working through Vale's public freight records and land filings. On the 3rd evening, after the collapse, she spread her papers on the kitchen table and called Rafe and Beatrice in from the porch. The pattern was straightforward once the records were laid in order. Vale or a connected buyer had purchased road easements, ferry rights, and river crossings, following at least 4 major transportation accidents in the region over the past 10 years. In each case, Vale Freight had moved in to fill the resulting void in local supply lines. The accidents weren't clustered at the same site. They were spread out, different locations, different causes, but the timing relative to Vale's acquisitions was consistent. "He's not responding to accidents," Beatrice said. "He's creating them." Nell nodded slowly. "A freight monopoly through attrition. If you control the only safe roads and river crossings, you control everything that moves through this valley." Rafe was quiet. He looked at the records for a long time. "The inspection of Blackwater Bridge," he said finally. "The one before my father's, before the collapse that killed Malcolm Holloway." Beatrice looked at him. "My father was part of that inspection team," Rafe said. She waited. He didn't say more than that. He looked at the table, not at her, and she could see that he was deciding how much further to take it. She didn't push. Whatever he was holding back was still his to hold. For now. He looked up. "What do you need for a safer lifting system?" he said. "For the cattle operation going forward." It was a deliberate change of subject. She accepted it. She sketched the principle on the back of one of Nell's papers. The compound pulley-reduced peak force at any single connection point, which meant smaller components under less individual stress. You could design a system that moved more weight than a direct lift rig while putting less strain on the pins and brackets. The critical rule was always to divide the load across multiple connection points rather than concentrating it at one. A single strong link created a single catastrophic failure point. Distributed load created distributed safety. They built the new frame together over 2 days. Rafe followed her instructions without adding his own. When she changed her mind about the placement of the second wheel, he moved it without comment. When she told him the center anchor needed to drop 6 inches, he did it and asked why afterward. She explained that the angle of force through a pulley system changed the effective load calculation. A bracket pulling at 15 degrees from vertical was working harder than one pulling at 90. Keeping the anchor low kept the pull angle clean. He listened carefully, the way someone listens when they're actually revising their understanding rather than waiting to speak. On the second evening, he examined her hands while she was cleaning the chalk from the measuring marks. "You tore these on the brake wheel," he said. She looked down. The rope burns from the rescue had broken in 2 places. He said nothing further. He went inside and came back with a cloth and a tin of salve and sat beside her on the workbench. He treated the brakes without speaking, and she let him, and neither of them made anything of it. The light was going. The hands had cleared out. Nell was visible through the kitchen window. Rafe was close enough that she could see the line of tension along his jaw, something he was working up to or working against. She hadn't decided which. Then Jonah's horse came through the south gate at a dead gallop, riderless. Both of them stood up at the same moment. The horse was lathered and spooked, running for the barn. There was nothing on the saddle but the boy's canvas satchel, tied to the horn the same way he always left it when he went into town after lessons. Beatrice was down the porch steps before the horse reached the corral. She caught the bridle and unhooked the satchel. Inside was Jonah's arithmetic slate, his spare pencil, and nothing else. "He didn't come back from town," she said. Mateo was already asking the hands whether anyone had seen him leave. One hand had. Jonah had ridden toward the Vale freight yard around 4 o'clock. Rafe looked at Beatrice. "He took that iron collar," she said, "the one from the yard. I told him not to mention it to anyone, and I should have told him not to go back." Rafe shook his head once. "This isn't your doing." But they were moving already, pulling coats from the hooks by the door, and Mateo was saddling horses, and Nell was at the window watching them go. They rode to the Vale freight yard first, locked and dark. No horses in the corral. Whoever had been there had cleared out. They rode to the bridge at Blackwater Creek next. Following the hunch, Beatrice didn't bother explaining. At the ruins of the old approach road, 20 feet from where the first timber of the original bridge had once rested, a lantern had been left burning low on a fence post. Beneath it lay Jonah's scarf, folded once and weighted down with a piece of broken stone. Beneath the scarf was a paper. 3 words and a direction, written in a hand she didn't recognize. "Bring Holloway's book below the river." Beatrice held the lantern up. The old bridge was dark above the water. The river ran high from the week's rain. Rafe read the message over her shoulder and didn't say anything. She folded the paper into her coat pocket. She stood at the base of the bridge and worked it out in her head. Most bridges of this type, built in the 1870s, included maintenance tunnels in the foundation. Her father had designed the one at Blackwater himself. She knew his standard specifications. He always built an inspection chamber into the main pier, accessible from the riverbank through a service passage. The passage ran below the waterline at flood stage, which meant most people didn't know it existed. Vale knew about her father's bridge because he had supplied the iron for it. He would have seen the foundation drawings. "Jonah is inside the bridge," she said. Rafe looked at the water running black beneath the span. "Below the river, there's a maintenance chamber built into the main foundation pier. My father designed this bridge. I know where the service entrance is." Rafe looked at her. "You can stay up here and direct me in." She picked up the lantern. "The construction symbols my father used aren't standardized. They're his own notation. I'd be the only one who could read them in the dark, inside a flooded tunnel." He didn't argue further. They found the service entrance on the north bank, mostly hidden by encroaching brush and a decade of silt. The door was iron original and had been opened recently. The hinge marks in the mud were fresh, Inside, the passage was narrow and low. Stone walls, packed earth underfoot. The lantern threw light about 10 feet ahead. Beyond that was dark. Beatrice went first. Rafe followed. The gate was 30 feet in. Iron, hinged from the ceiling, dropped after they cleared the passage threshold. The sound it made going down was final. Beatrice turned and checked it. No latch on the interior side. She had expected this. She held the lantern to the wall where her father would have marked the junction points. The symbols were there, small and precise, chiseled into the stone before the passage was sealed. A circle meant load-bearing column. A horizontal bar meant level. A downward arrow with a small cross meant the maintenance chamber. She took the left passage at the first fork. The water on the floor was cold and mid-calf. It was rising slowly, which told her the river was still coming up. She moved steadily and tried not to calculate how much time they had before the passage was above manageable depth. Behind her, Rafe's breathing changed. She slowed and turned. He had one hand against the wall, his leg. She had seen him hide the pain for 2 days and do it well. Down here, wet and cold and walking uneven stone, he couldn't hide it. "Put your hand on my shoulder," she said. He did after a pause. She adjusted her pace to match his. They reached the maintenance chamber door. Locked old iron. But the lock mechanism had rusted, and the hasp had been replaced recently. She could see the newer metal in the lantern light. From inside came a sound. "Movement, Jonah," she said it at the door. A pause. "Miss Holloway?" She sagged very slightly and straightened up immediately. "Are you hurt?" "Bruised. They locked me in. There are 2 of them. They left a while ago and said they'd come back." She examined the hasp. The new metal was softer than the surrounding iron. She handed the lantern to Rafe and used the chisel edge of her measuring rule against the top mounting screw. It was slow work, and she broke a sweat doing it, despite the cold water. The hasp gave. Jonah came out blinking into the lantern light. He had a cut above one eyebrow and his coat was torn, but he was on his feet. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the iron collar. He handed it to Beatrice without being asked. "I hid it when they took me. They searched my coat, but not my shirt." She took it. Good thinking. He was looking between her and Rafe, measuring the situation. "There's something else. I heard them talking while they thought I was asleep. Vale's planning to destroy this bridge while a military cattle convoy crosses it. They're going to blame Mr. Mercer for sabotaging the structure and use it to take permanent control of the freight routes." Rafe straightened against the wall. "When 5 days?" Jonah said. "The convoy arrives in 5 days." The water reached Jonah's knee. They needed to move. Beatrice had been holding the lantern toward the back wall of the maintenance chamber while Jonah spoke. Her father had been down here. She knew it as certainly as she knew anything about how he worked. He always left documentation inside the structures he built. Insurance against the day when a design decision needed to be explained. She moved into the chamber and ran the light along the base of the far wall. There, a flat stone slightly different from the others, seated with a mortar that was a shade lighter than the surrounding joints. Her father had replaced this stone after the original construction. She worked the edge free with her fingers and pulled it out. Behind it was a folded oilcloth packet. She opened it. Bridge plans. Her father's handwriting in the margins, notes on load calculations and component substitutions. And on the final page, tucked inside the plans themselves, a separate document. Not a technical drawing. A correspondence record. She held the lantern directly over it. A payment record, dated 1880, 1 year before the bridge opened, and 1 year before it collapsed. Lucian Vale on one side, Warren Mercer on the other. A sum of money, and beneath it, a brief notation in a hand she didn't recognize. "Inspection passed per agreement. Components certified." She stood very still. Warren Mercer, Rafe's father. She heard Rafe move behind her, stepping carefully through the water. He looked at the document over her shoulder. The chamber was completely quiet. "Rafe." She kept her voice level with some effort. "Did you know Your father was part of the inspection that cleared the Blackwater Bridge before it opened? He was silent for too long. Yes, he said. She turned to face him. He told me before he died, Rafe said. He accepted money from Vale to approve the components without a full inspection. He didn't know the iron was defective. He thought it was a routine sign-off on standard materials. His voice was even but stripped of its usual steadiness. When the bridge failed and your father died, he knew what he'd done. He tried to come forward. Vale had enough on him by then to ruin the whole family. He stayed quiet. Beatrice looked at him. She had spent 7 years believing her father had made a mistake, that his calculations had been wrong, that the collapse had been an engineering failure rather than a deliberate act. She had argued against that conclusion privately, in the margins of his notebook, in letters she never sent to the investigating board. But the official record said Malcolm Holloway had certified defective components. Rafe had known for years that that record was wrong. He had known while she sat in his kitchen and taught his children and risked her life in his loading yard. He had known when she told him her father used to build bridges. He had known and said nothing. "You let me wonder whether my father was responsible," she said. "All this time. Beatrice, I'm not finished." She folded the plans and the document into the oilcloth and put it inside her coat. "You made a choice about what truth I was allowed to have. I didn't ask you to protect me from it. I didn't need you to decide what I could bear." He didn't deny it. "No," he said, "you didn't." The water was past Jonah's waist now. Beatrice turned and took the boy's arm and led the way back through the passage. She kept her pace and didn't look back. At the junction before the gate, Jonah stopped and crouched at the base of the wall. He had seen something she'd passed. He pulled a rusted pin from a slot in the gate mechanism, and the locked barrier swung up on a counterweight, clear of the passage floor. He looked pleased with himself, despite the cut above his eye. She allowed herself one genuine smile. Well done. They came out into the night air. Jonah was shivering, and Beatrice was soaked from the chest down, and Rafe was moving on his bad leg with the careful deliberateness of someone managing real pain. For a moment, they stood on the bank and breathed. Then, without either of them planning it, Rafe reached out and caught her wrist gently. She turned. He was looking at her in the dark, unguarded, in a way she hadn't seen from him before. He said her name once. Just that. She kissed him. It was brief and quiet, and she stepped back first, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "That was before I found the document." He nodded slowly. "I know. It doesn't undo what you kept from me." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She turned toward the horses. Jonah, with the self-possession of a 15-year-old, who understood more than anyone gave him credit for, walked ahead and pretended to be very interested in untying the reins. They rode back toward town in silence. Beatrice went through the documents in her head. Warren Mercer had taken Vale's money. He had cleared the inspection. He had known what happened when the bridge failed, and he had spent the rest of his life with that knowledge. His son had spent years carrying the ledger. Rafe hadn't mentioned yet the one Beatrice was now certain existed somewhere in the main house at Mercy Ridge. She was building the full picture now, and she didn't need Rafe to complete it for her. She would take the plans to the territorial marshal herself, if she had to. When the lights of Juniper Crossing appeared ahead, something else appeared with them. Horses at the main road. 4 men with a lantern, positioned deliberately. Rafe slowed. A county officer stepped forward from the group. He had a paper in his hand. "Rafe Mercer," the officer said. "I have a warrant for your arrest. Charge of attempted sabotage of Blackwater Bridge." Beatrice went still. The officer looked uncomfortable. "We have a witness." "Who?" Rafe asked. "Silas Reed," the officer said. "He states he saw you personally removing the integrity pins from the Blackwater Bridge Foundation 3 nights ago." Beatrice recognized the name. Silas Reed had apprenticed under her father for 2 years before the bridge collapse. He had been young then, and she had barely known him. He had left the region after the inquiry. Someone had brought him back. Rafe dismounted slowly. He handed his reins to Jonah without being asked and walked toward the officer without protest. He looked at Beatrice once before the officers closed around him. She held his gaze and gave him nothing he could read in it. The officer led Rafe toward town. The road was dark behind them. Vale came to the jail at 8 in the morning. He didn't come inside. He waited on the boardwalk and asked the deputy to tell Beatrice Holloway he'd like a word. The deputy relayed this to Nell, who relayed it to Beatrice, who was sitting at the kitchen table with her father's notebook open and the oilcloth documents from the Bridge Foundation spread flat. She went. Vale stood, with his hat in his hands, and his back to the sun, which was deliberate. She couldn't read his expression as clearly with the light behind him. "This can resolve itself simply," he said. "Give me Malcolm's notebook. Everything your father documented, every drawing, every margin note. Leave the territory inside of 48 hours. He paused. "Rafe Mercer walks out of that jail by tonight." She looked at him. "You'd release him on my compliance," she said, and Silas Reed recants his statement. "Silas says what I tell Silas to say. I see." She held his gaze, and the defective iron components on every property in the valley, and the 1,879 production batch that was supposed to have been destroyed. "That all stays buried." Vale said nothing. "No," Beatrice said. She turned and went back inside. Nell was already moving when she returned to the kitchen. She had Rafe's father's confession ledger open on the table, a document Rafe had sent out from the jail that morning through the deputy who owed him a favor. Nell had her good pen out and 3 sheets of clean paper. "How many copies?" Nell asked. 3, Beatrice said. "Territorial Marshal, the Federal Land Office in Portland, and the Regional Military Commander. The convoy is 3 days out. The commander needs to know his men are riding toward a bridge that's been tampered with." Nell was already writing. Beatrice sat down with the ledger. Warren Mercer's handwriting was cramped and slanted, the penmanship of a man who hadn't been educated formally past his early years. The entries were methodical despite that. Dates, amounts, initials. A record kept by someone who understood that guilt needed witnesses, even if that witness was only yourself. The entry for November 1880 was the longest. It described the inspection in detail. The components were not checked individually. Vale's man had presented a certification sheet, and Warren had signed it without pulling a single pin from the stack. He had noted the crescent marks on the stack and had been told they were quality indicators. He had written, in the margin beside that entry, in a different ink, and clearly added later, "I went to Holloway's house on the 14th of March, 1881. He was not home. I left no message." The bridge opened on the 16th. On the 22nd, the center span came down. Malcolm Holloway died in the river. I knew. I should have made him pull the pins before it opened. I signed a paper and took me, and I knew. Beatrice sat with that for a while. Then she went to the jail. Rafe was on his feet when she came in. The deputy let her stand at the cell door and gave them space. She told him what the ledger said. All of it. He listened without interrupting. "Your father tried to warn mine," she said when she finished. "He came to the house 2 days before the bridge opened. He lost his nerve and left without a message." Rafe looked at the floor. "Yes, and you had this ledger?" "Yes, you had it while I taught your children and repaired your lifting system and investigated your property and asked you to trust my judgment." She kept her voice level. "You sat across from me at that table. While I wondered whether my father's calculations were wrong, you had the proof that they weren't, and you chose to hold on to it." Rafe raised his eyes. "I was protecting my family's name, at the cost of mine," she said. "You had no right to decide which truths I could endure." He was quiet. He didn't argue it or explain it further. "You're right?" he said. "I don't expect you to forgive that. Not quickly," she said. He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. "Beatrice," he said, "you've done everything here that needed doing. Nell has the ledger. The copies are going out. You don't have anything left to prove to this town or to me." He paused. You deserve the freedom to leave. If that's what you want, leave. I'm not going to ask you to stay. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked out. The stagecoach office was 2 blocks down the main street. She stood at the counter with her bag and bought a fare to Portland and stood outside in the morning light, waiting for the 10 o'clock departure. At 9:40, she heard it. Low at first, distant, the particular rhythm of a large herd moving on hard road. She turned east. The military cattle convoy was 3 days early. The column stretched back along the eastern road as far as she could see. Dozens of soldiers, several hundred head of cattle, wagons, all of it heading toward Blackwater Bridge. She thought about the cut cable Vale had made in the bridge's central line. She thought about the explosives he planned to use to frighten the herd. A stampeding herd of that size on a compromised bridge above a river running high from spring rain. The stagecoach arrived on time. The driver climbed down and opened the door. Beatrice picked up her bag. She thought about 30 men standing in a collapsed yard, not knowing which way to pull. She set the bag down. Next week, she told the driver. He shrugged and drove on without her. She found Silas Reed at the Vale freight yard. He was expecting someone else, and his face went through several expressions when she appeared. You can help me get into the bridge machinery room, she said. It wasn't a question. Silas was a small man and nervous, and had apparently spent the past 7 years in a situation he hadn't fully understood until recently. He said Vale had told him the testimony was just to buy time. Nobody was actually going to get hurt. People are going to get hurt, Beatrice said today, unless I can get into that machinery room and stabilize the central cable before the herd crosses. Silas took her through a passage at the base of the north tower she wouldn't have found on her own. She was inside the main machinery chamber before she registered that he hadn't followed her in. The lock turned from outside. She heard him walking away. The chamber was large, dim, full of counterweight apparatus. She could hear the river clearly through the stone walls. Then she heard something else. A gate opening upstream, the sound of water moving in volume. It came through the floor drain first, fast and cold, filling the low sections of the chamber immediately. Vale had activated an upstream release. The room would fill completely within 20 minutes. She stood in rising water and looked at what she had to work with. 2 counterweight drums. A central cable running up through a sleeve in the ceiling. A maintenance ladder. Her red-braided rope coiled at her hip, where she had carried it since the loading yard collapse. Iron brackets at 3 heights on the south wall. She started moving, water at her knees. She ran a loop of her red rope through the upper bracket and over the secondary counterweight drum. The drum was fixed, but could be used as a redirecting wheel. She tied the working end to the bottom rung of the maintenance ladder and ran 3 passes through the bracket sequence, building the same compound path she had used in the loading yard. The principle was identical. She was redirecting force, not generating it. She wasn't trying to lift herself with her arms. She was using the weight of the water rising around her to increase tension on the line, and using that tension against the counterweight to push herself upward rather than pull. She braced her feet on the wall, water at her chest. She released the ladder rung and let the system take her. It worked, or nearly. She got 4 feet off the ground before the rope angle went wrong. She adjusted. 3 feet. 5. Water at her chin. A sound from above her. Metal on metal. The maintenance hatch in the ceiling opened from outside. Jonah's face appeared in the opening. Miss Holloway, he said with the measured calm of someone who had decided to be very brave and was managing it. She handed up the red rope end. He anchored it to something solid above, and she climbed the rest of the way. On pure grip, she came out onto the bridge tower catwalk above the river. Below her, the military convoy had reached the near bank. It was beginning. The first explosion came from the south bank. Not large. Vale hadn't needed large. He'd needed enough noise to push the lead cattle forward, and at the front of a column that size, forward, meant onto the bridge. The herd compressed. The soldiers at the rear didn't know what was happening at the front. The cattle in the middle couldn't stop. 300 animals began crossing Blackwater Bridge in a mass instead of a controlled line, and the bridge, weakened at its central cable and missing its integrity pins, began to move under the load in a long, slow oscillation. Beatrice could feel it through the catwalk. Nell had gotten the copies out. Beatrice knew this because the county officer had appeared at the jail before 9 o'clock with the new evidence in his hands. And Rafe had walked out of the jail at 1:15. He came up the north bank at a run, which told her his leg was still more capable than Dr. Miriam had estimated. He looked up and found her on the catwalk and said nothing, just assessed the situation with a rapid scan that covered the bridge, the herd, the soldiers, and the river. She called down to him. The central cable is cut halfway through. If the bridge oscillates past a certain amplitude, the cable fails and the center span drops. I need to release the north counterweight in a controlled sequence to reduce the resonance, but I need someone below the bridge to hold my braking line while I do it. If I release without the brake set, the counterweight drops all at once and the cable snaps immediately. He didn't ask whether she was certain. "Tell me where to be," he said. She directed him to the maintenance crawl beneath the bridge deck, accessible from the North Tower base. He went in without hesitation. Below her on the road, Mateo had ridden hard from Mercy Ridge and was already moving along the convoy's flank. She could see him leaning from the saddle to speak to the soldiers. He broke open a ranch fence panel at the road's edge, creating a gap where the lead animals could be redirected off the bridge into a field. The cowboys behind him moved immediately. No hesitation, no need to be told twice. She had 30 men on the ground, and every one of them was watching for her signals. Rafe's voice came up through the maintenance hatch below. "I'm in. I have the line." She tied her red rope to the counterweight release arm and ran it through the upper wheel to give him enough mechanical advantage to hold it from below. "On my count," she called down. She gave the hand signal to the ground crew. 6 men positioned at the south end of the bridge split the remaining cattle into 2 groups and began moving them off the span in alternating sequences, reducing the synchronized movement that was feeding the oscillation. It was the same principle as the loading yard. Uncoordinated mass made things worse. Deliberate sequencing reduced the load at any single moment. The bridge settled slightly. One of the soldiers who'd been at the front of the column saw what was happening and began directing his men to hold the rear. The message passed back along the line. Vale was somewhere on the south bank. She had tracked him during the confusion, but lost him when the cattle began moving. She found him. He was at a secondary mechanism at the base of the south tower, a release wheel, connected by cable to the remaining northern counterweight, the one Beatrice had not yet touched. If he turned that wheel, the counterweight dropped and the cable sheared instantly. She put the red rope's end under a safety cleat and climbed down the catwalk ladder to the tower level. Jonah was already moving through the maintenance conduit. On the tower's interior, the narrow service passage her father had built for inspection access. He came out at the south tower base, 30 feet from Vale. Vale turned the wheel. Rafe hit it from below. He had come through the underbridge crawl to the south side, and he came up through the access hatch at the tower base. At the same moment, Vale moved. He caught the release wheel with both hands and stopped it. Vale pulled a sidearm. Rafe took it from him with a sharp turn of his wrist that used Vale's own grip against him, and then he stepped back. He didn't hit him. He didn't threaten him. He held the gun at his side and looked at Vale with an expression of utter exhaustion. "Enough," Rafe said. Vale's composure, maintained for 7 years, and through 2 counties' worth of disasters, went out of him all at once. He looked suddenly very small inside his good coat. Silas came around the south tower corner. He had turned back. Beatrice would not know until later that it was Jonah that had done it. The sight of the boy crawling through the maintenance conduit to help her, while the river ran high beneath them. I'll testify, Silas said. Everything. The iron batches, the bridge inspection, all the contracts. I'll testify to everything. Jonah reached into his shirt and produced the iron collar. He handed it to the nearest soldier. On the bridge above them, the last of the cattle moved off the span. The oscillation slowed. Beatrice was already on the counterweight housing, releasing the north weight in a controlled three-stage sequence that brought the cable tension back into its safe range. The bridge shuddered once. Then it was still. Nell arrived on horseback at the south gate 40 minutes later with a document in her hand and the focused expression of someone who had ridden fast and wasn't done yet. The territorial marshal had received the confession ledger by telegraph relay. A federal officer was 2 hours behind her. Vale was sitting on the ground with 2 soldiers standing over him. The crescent-marked coupling from the failed center pin lay on a board in front of a growing assembly of soldiers, townspeople, and county officials. Beatrice had placed it there herself and explained, without haste, what the mark indicated, where the production batch had come from, and why every component bearing that mark in the valley needed to be quarantined before it carried another load. The soldier, who had accepted Jonah's iron collar, was writing it all down. Rafe came to stand beside her when she finished. His leg was bad. He'd pushed it hard, and she could see the cost in his face. But he stood straight. The bridge is holding, he said. For now, she said. It needs proper repair before commercial traffic resumes. 2 months minimum, possibly 3. He nodded slowly. He was looking at the structure, but his attention was split. Mercy Ridge, he said. I destroyed the remaining loading platform. The cattle scattered. We won't make the government payment. I know. The ranch may not survive the spring. I know that too, she said. He looked at her. She looked at the bridge. One problem at a time, she said. A federal officer arrived before dark and took Vale into custody. Silas sat with the soldiers and talked for 2 hours without stopping. Jonah fell asleep against the south tower wall with his hat over his face. Beatrice climbed back up to the machinery room and hung her red rope on the interior wall bracket, where it would stay until the room was properly restored. She didn't know yet that it would stay there permanently. She didn't know a lot of things yet, but she knew the bridge was standing. For tonight, that was enough. 3 months after the bridge disaster, Juniper Crossing was still deciding what it was going to become. Vale's arrest had cleared the freight routes. His property and contracts went into a territorial holding. 2 investors from Portland arrived in June with an offer to purchase everything: the bridge rights, the ferry crossings, the road easements. They were polite, and their paperwork was in order. Beatrice sat across from them at the land office table and told them no. They looked at the ranchers and merchants assembled in the room. The ranchers and merchants looked at her. She explained the problem plainly. Place a private monopoly with another private monopoly, and the valley spent the next 10 years building toward the same crisis. One owner controlling the only passage between counties had never served anyone but the owner. A cooperative, she said. Community-owned. Ranchers contribute labor. Merchants contribute building materials and supply costs. The military has recovered construction material they're willing to release. Nobody owns the bridge. Everyone maintains it. One of the investors said that sounded complicated. Complicated is manageable, Beatrice said. Monopoly is catastrophic. We've already demonstrated that. The vote took 3 days. It passed. Rafe opened Mercer Narrows as a temporary public crossing that same week, without charging a fee, while the bridge repairs began. Nell organized the communication between contributing parties and kept the accounts. She was precise and trusted, and became the cooperative's first formal manager within a month, without anyone making an announcement about it. It simply happened and everyone accepted it, which was usually how Nell operated. Mateo came back to Mercy Ridge on a permanent limp that he declined to discuss. He trained the younger hands with a patience he hadn't shown before. He told them, more than once, that strength applied incorrectly was the same as weakness, and that the first question in any load-bearing situation was not how much force you had, but where you were putting it. Dr. Miriam established a permanent emergency station near the new bridge approach, staffed by a rotating pair of volunteers she recruited and trained herself. Silas Reed was given a reduced sentence. He spent the following year doing restitution work on the bridge and surrounding roads, which suited him more than confinement would have. He was not forgiven by everyone. He was accepted back by most. Jonah began a formal apprenticeship. It was Beatrice's idea and Rafe's endorsement, and Jonah's complete cooperation. He arrived early every morning and stayed until the light gave out, and by the end of summer, he could read a stress diagram and calculate load distribution and tie an industrial rigging hitch in under 40 seconds. At the bridge memorial, a stone marker near the North Tower entrance, the names of the original builders were listed. Warren Mercer's name was removed at Rafe's written request to the county, a formal and quiet process that cost him more than he showed. Malcolm Holloway's name was added above the structural specifications plate, where it remained. The engineering company in Portland sent a letter in September. They had heard about the bridge disaster and its resolution. They offered Beatrice a senior position. She read the letter twice and put it in her coat. That evening, she told Rafe about it. They were standing near the ruins of the old loading structure, which Rafe had not yet rebuilt. She had come to see it and found him already there, looking at the empty space. He listened. He didn't ask what she was going to do. He didn't tell her she should stay, or that leaving would be wrong. He looked at the ground where the platform had been. Portland is a serious offer, he said. Yes, you've earned it. I've earned several things, she said. He looked at her. She met his eyes. Rafe, she said, I don't want to be loved because I saved your life. He was quiet. I want to be loved without having to prove my worth every day, she said. Without a test at the beginning of it, without someone deciding whether I qualify, he turned to face her fully. He had the look of a man choosing his words with real care, not to protect himself, but because the words mattered. I said, a woman like you couldn't save me, he said, because I thought strength only came in one shape. I was wrong about your strength, and I was wrong about what it meant to be saved. He paused. You didn't just pull me out from under that timber. You made me face what I'd been carrying. My father, the choice I made to keep quiet while your family spent 7 years under a false verdict. She didn't say anything. I don't need you to rescue me again, he said. I only want the chance to stand beside you while we build something together. She looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was flat and warm, and the river was audible from where they stood. I've negotiated a regional contract, she said. Independent. My own terms. I can base here and take projects throughout the valley. He waited. I'll need a name for the company, she said. What name did you choose? Holloway Bridge and Lifting Works. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that's the right name. I want full ownership of my designs, she said. Complete professional independence and an equal partnership in the Narrows transportation operation. You'll have all of it, he said. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. They stood in the last of the evening light and didn't rush toward anything. There was time now. The bridge was repaired. The valley was still learning to govern itself, and Jonah had 3 years of proper education ahead of him and a talent for rigging that Beatrice intended to develop systematically. There was a great deal of work to do. In October, the first wagon came through the Mercy Ridge Gate, marked with the new company name, painted in black on a whiteboard, nailed to the side panel. It carried tools, measuring equipment, 2 coils of rope, and a set of structural drawings for a footbridge in the north pasture. Rafe was at the gate when it arrived. He studied the heavily loaded wagon bed and looked at the small ranch bridge at the foot of the path. Can that bridge hold all of this? He asked. Beatrice stepped down from the wagon seat. She opened her brass measuring rule and walked the near approach, checking the timber dimensions and the footing depth. She pressed her thumb against the main beam and looked at the underside and stood back. Then she looked at Rafe. "It will," she said, "provided you follow my instructions this time." He opened the gate. She led the way in. Beatrice Holloway never asked anyone to believe in her. She just kept working. She calculated the load, set the brake, and told 30 men which way to pull. Not because she needed to prove something, but because someone was going to die if she didn't. That's the quiet truth at the center of this story. Competence doesn't announce itself. It shows up when the beam falls. We live in a world that decides what a person is capable of before they open their mouth. Rafe Mercer did that. He looked at Beatrice and saw someone who needed a room and a wage, and maybe a little patience. He didn't see the woman who had spent years studying how weight moves through iron and timber, how force travels through a system, how the difference between the right angle and the wrong one is the difference between someone living and someone dying. He didn't see any of that until the platform came down and 30 men ran out of ideas. Here's what this story is really teaching us. Strength doesn't come in one shape. It never did. The men in that yard had muscle and rope and horses and every intention of helping. What they didn't have was the knowledge of where to put all of that. Beatrice didn't outmuscle anyone. She outthought them. And that's a lesson that has nothing to do with the 1880s. It lives right now, in every room where someone is overlooked before they've been heard, in every meeting where the quietest person at the table is the one who actually knows how to fix the problem. Rafe had to lose everything: the platform, the cattle, the family name he'd been protecting for years before he understood what had been standing in front of him the whole time. That's another hard truth this story carries. We hold on to the wrong things because letting go feels like losing. But Warren Mercer's name on a memorial plaque was never going to make anything right. The truth was always more valuable than the reputation built on top of it. Rafe finally understood that. It cost him, and it freed him. Beatrice didn't stay at Mercy Ridge because Rafe needed her. She stayed because she chose to. She negotiated her terms, kept her name on the company, retained ownership of her designs, and built something that belonged to her. That distinction matters more than it might seem. There is a difference between belonging somewhere and being absorbed into it. Beatrice never confused the two. She knew exactly what she was worth, long before anyone else in that valley figured it out. If this story gave you anything worth keeping, it's probably that. You don't have to shrink yourself to fit the space someone else designed for you. You measure the structure, you find the load-bearing points, and you build something that holds. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, events, or historical figures is coincidental and unintentional.